Thanksgiving is celebrated in the United States on the fourth Thursday of November. This beloved American holiday traces its roots to a moment in the early 17th century when settlers from England and the native Wampanoag people shared an autumn harvest feast that has since become iconic in the story of America's founding. But to understand Thanksgiving and its historical associations, we must journey back to the colonial period, an era defined by great ambition, conflict, hardship, and cultural exchange. The story of European colonization in North America begins long before the famous feast. By the late 1500s and early 1600s, England was eager to establish a foothold in the New World. The Spanish and the French had already claimed vast territories in the Americas. English explorers and investors, seeking wealth and opportunity, set their sights on the eastern shores of what is now the United States. In 1607, a band of adventurers from the Virginia Company of London arrived on the banks of a river they named the James in honor of their king. There they established Jamestown, Virginia, the first successful English colony in North America. Life in Jamestown was fraught with challenges from the very beginning. Disease, hunger, and conflict with the indigenous Powhatan people threatened the survival of the settlement. Most of the early colonists were gentlemen, unaccustomed to agricultural labor and unprepared for the realities of life in a new land. The early years, known as the starving time, saw many perish as food supplies dwindled and the settlements struggled to become self-sufficient. Over time, however, Jamestown found a way to not only survive but thrive. The key to this transformation was the introduction of a lucrative cash crop: tobacco. Native to the Americas, tobacco had been used by indigenous peoples for centuries. English colonists, led by figures like John Rolfe, began cultivating tobacco plants and soon discovered that the crop grew exceptionally well in Virginia's warm, humid climate. The sweet, mild variety of tobacco that Rolfe developed quickly became popular in England, and demand soared. This cash crop dictated the economic fate of Virginia and led to the rapid expansion of plantations and settlements. As the plantations multiplied, so did the need for labor. At first, the English relied on the headright system to attract settlers. Under the headright system, those willing to pay their own way, or more commonly, the way for others, to Virginia were granted tracts of land, typically 50 acres per person. This incentive encouraged wealthy investors to fund the passage of laborers who, in exchange, agreed to work for a set period as indentured servants. An indentured servant was bound by contract to labor for 4 to 7 years in return for passage, room, and board. Once their contract was complete, indentured servants might receive freedom dues of land or resources and join the ranks of small landowners. But as the cost of passage decreased and the colonial population grew, the headright system alone could no longer satisfy the ever-growing need for cheap labor. A tragic and consequential shift unfolded. Slavery became further entrenched in Virginia. The first recorded Africans arrived in Jamestown in 1619, initially treated similarly to indentured servants. Over time, a system of race-based hereditary slavery prevailed. By the end of the 17th century, the labor force on Virginia's tobacco plantations was increasingly made up of enslaved Africans, whose bondage would become central to both the economy and society of the southern colonies. The rise of the tobacco economy and the changing nature of labor profoundly shaped the class structure of the Virginia colony. At the top stood wealthy planters who owned vast estates and wielded significant political power. Below them were smaller farmers and freed indentured servants who owned less land and struggled for influence. The landless poor and enslaved Africans made up the lowest rungs of society, lacking property and rights. This highly stratified society bred both economic opportunity for some and deep-seated inequalities for others. Not far from Virginia, another English experiment in colonization took root. The Maryland colony. Founded in 1632 by Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore, Maryland was established as a haven for English Catholics, who faced persecution at home. Like Virginia, Maryland's economy relied heavily on tobacco, and it too adopted forms of labor similar to its neighbor. Yet it distinguished itself for a time with policies of religious tolerance, guaranteeing a degree of freedom not found elsewhere in the English colonies. The Maryland Toleration Act of 1649, for example, granted religious freedom to all Christians. A notable, though limited, step toward religious pluralism in the New World. While the Chesapeake colonies of Virginia and Maryland were shaped by plantation agriculture and hierarchies rooted in land and labor, the English also established new settlements further north. A very different kind of colony emerged in New England, where groups of religious dissenters, most famously the Pilgrims, sought to create communities built upon their own spiritual values. In 1620, a small group of English separatists, later called Pilgrims, boarded the Mayflower and set sail for Virginia. Storms blew them far off course, landing them at Cape Cod, in present-day Massachusetts. There the Pilgrims founded Plymouth Colony. Amidst the biting wind and unfamiliar landscape, they endured a brutal first winter, with many succumbing to illness and hunger. Yet through the aid of local Native Americans, particularly the Wampanoag known as Squanto, the survivors learned essential farming skills, how to grow corn, fish, and hunt in the New England wilds. The Pilgrims' first successful harvest in 1621 gave rise to a celebration that later inspired the myth of the first Thanksgiving. The feast, shared between the colonists and members of the Wampanoag tribe, was a moment of rare fellowship amidst a history often marked by conflict and misunderstanding. Over the centuries, the story of this meal, symbolizing gratitude, cooperation, and survival, grew into a foundational American tradition. Yet it's important to remember that this narrative simplifies a much more complicated reality, one of difficult encounters between settlers and native peoples and the transformation of both cultures in the years that followed. A decade after the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, a much larger and more organized group came to Massachusetts. These were the Puritans, who sought to purify the Church of England and build a new society based on their religious ideals. Led by John Winthrop, the Puritans founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Their vision was to establish a city on a hill, a model Christian community that would shine as an example to the world. This biblical reference encapsulated the Puritans' sense of mission. They believed themselves to be building not just a settlement, but a beacon for spiritual transformation. The Puritans' approach to governance was deeply informed by their religious beliefs. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was a theocracy in practice. Civic and church leadership were often intertwined, and only male members of the Congregationalist Church could vote or hold political office. The colony operated through a system of town meetings and a general court, forging a distinctive tradition of self-rule. Yet while Massachusetts was innovative in promoting local governance, it was not a society of universal inclusion or equality. Dissenters, those who challenged the Puritan orthodoxy, such as Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, were often banished or suppressed. The quest to maintain a pure community sometimes veered into intolerance. The question of equality and representation in the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a complex one. On the one hand, the colony embraced a relatively broad franchise among male church members and encouraged participatory government through town meetings. A sharp contrast to the more hierarchical and aristocratic societies of Europe. On the other hand, political and religious rights were tightly circumscribed, with women, non-white settlers, non-Christians, and even Christians outside the Congregationalist Church excluded from meaningful participation. Throughout these early decades, documents and charters governed the organization of colonial society. Some of these, like the Mayflower Compact, were remarkable for their time. Before setting foot on shore, the Pilgrims drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact, agreeing to form a civil body politic and to enact just and equal laws for the general good, an early influential experiment in self-government. Other foundational documents would emerge as well, each reflecting the values and tensions of the communities that drafted them. The lives and choices of these early colonists, whether struggling to survive in Jamestown, forging new communities in Maryland, or building their city on a hill in Massachusetts, shaped the social, religious, and political foundations of what would become the United States. The blending of traditions, the clashes of cultures, and the emergence of new forms of governance all left their mark on American identity. As we gather each year in late November to share a meal and give thanks, we remember not only the fellowship of the first Thanksgiving, but also the larger story of courage, conflict, and creation that defines the American colonial experience. These stories remind us of the dreams and contradictions at the nation's founding, a legacy that continues to shape our understanding of community, opportunity, and justice today.